Test, test, 1, 2. Well, my friends, those that came here, I'm glad you did come so we can have a nice intimate conversation with Francois. First of all, let's welcome our friend all the way from New York here. Came in this afternoon. FK, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, Francois K. And as you pointed out, I'm here from New York, New York. I was lucky enough to have worked on quite a number of interesting records over the years. And I really appreciate you wanting to take the time to talk about tonight's topic.
Indeed. I mean, this is, obviously, we're speaking about one record in particular. Francois has done numerous amount of records. I mean, from the D Train, You're the One for Me, Keep On, Push in the Bush, right? You did that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, he was obviously the in-house engineer for Prelude Records and that kind of thing, right? Correct. We mix it, we did some production too.
Who hired engineers?
He hired engineers and remixes. Well, you did it all. Look at that.
Not always. No, I'm sorry.
But Francois is being very humble, man. He's done a lot of stuff. I mean, stuff that we couldn't. Because I was thinking about, what could we really talk about? But Go Bang is one of these records that kind of changed. It changed the way I think that we thought about music. And it was like it was out of space. Combination of jazz, funk, disco, soul, blue. It had all these different mixtures in it, And here in Chicago particularly, it had a very strong effect on our city, And Francois was highly responsible for the end result of how it came out, because the original sounded anything like that at all. I don't know if you want to play the original first.
If you'd like me to, certainly can.
So you need an example of what the deal is? Thank you for grabbing the door for us. This is the original. There's only so much we can do.
Let it play a little bit longer.
You had to work good out for you.
Obviously, this is like an art kind of record, comes from a different point of view. Just because it's not your point of view doesn't mean it's not valid.
Okay, was it actually?
I mean, just because it made me cringe when I heard it doesn't mean that it's bad.
Let me ask you a question. I mean, what was your initial reaction? I mean, outside of cringing. I mean, were you like, what am I going to do? What was the first?
It's just we kind of already knew what Arthur Russell was doing because he had collaborated with Nicky Siano. They did this project together, Kiss Me Again. Yeah. And that was reasonably successful in certain clubs, more real downtown kind of clubs, like the Garage. Obviously, Nicky would play because it was his production.
Right.
So
the gallery was open at that time.
In some various incarnations, but probably not the galleries, the place that people used to know as that really, really special club that he kept moving around.
Nicky did Cornbelt too, didn't he?
I'm not sure that he did know. And then Arthur Russell had collaborated with Steve DeQuisto to do this record, Loose Joints, which was also a pretty spectacularly awful vocal on the male side, because there was a male vocal version. But for some reason, Larry Duran had a hold of the multi-track, and he did this quick version in 15 minutes of the female version. Is It All Over My Face? And of course, that became a massive, massive hit. So we already kind of knew that Arthur was a quirky, very sort of experimental and left field kind of person. That certainly wasn't trying to compete with Gamble and Huff.
Right.
Or, for that matter, anyone at all. I think Arthur was clearly on the space, and he was just, his muse was really singing a very, very different song from what everyone else's muse was singing. So, as such, when this was brought to me, I kind of had a little bit of a reference as to what this was going to be about. And the thing that's really most interesting is that, so there was this guy, right? He was working in a video game arcade. He was the manager of a video game arcade. And he just calls me and he goes, I got your number. I'm starting a record label, and my first record, I really, really want you to mix it. And his name was Will Sokoloff. So I only had a number for him.
Sleeping Bag Records.
I only had a number for him at the video game arcade, so every time I would call him, I would hear like all the sound of video games in the background. It was like nice. Hey, Will, can you hear me? So he was really starting from scratch, and he had it in his head that he wanted me to go and do a mix of this song that he had. So he sends me like a rough mix of it. I just go like, okay, I can do a mix of it. I can see what I'm going to be able to do, and and then I kind of told him what it was going to cost, because I had to go in the studio, I had to pay for studio time and everything else. So he was paying everything out of his pocket, and of course, for him it was like a big shock to have to think of what it was going to cost between what I was going to charge him, plus the expenses and all that. So,
about how much was it at that time? Because a lot of people are producing things in their home now, so they don't really understand the idea.
In today's dollars, I think one day of studio time was going to be about $3,000, plus my fee for like a reduced price at the time was going to be like $3,000-4,000. So in total, in 2017 dollars, maybe $7,000-8,000 for going in. And there was a B-side as well, something called Clean on Your Knee.
Right.
So I agreed to do the whole thing, and the B-side obviously we just going to do quickly. I didn't say I was going to spend much time on it. So we came to some sort of an agreement, and I just went in the studio with this tape. These are the original tracks again. This stuff is like so meandering. To me, it was
characteristics in the record.
It's
but
like a
not-
jam session, but it doesn't have focus. So I guess the thing that I really was trying to do was to make it get some coherence, really. From my perspective, being that at that time I was mostly doing club mixes, it had to have like some kind of a thread. You know, whenever I was making a record, usually it was kind of implied that the thread was there because whoever composed it was pretty straightforward. There's, you know, verse, chorus, bridge,
Right.
instrumental parts, solo, this, that, whatever. In terms of structure, most records that I was asked to mix were already pretty set on how things were flowing and arranged. But this was a completely different approach because he basically got all these musicians in the studio, and as soon as they sat down, he would start the tape deck. He had tape machines running all the time. He would record everything that was going on during the sessions, even when people were tuning up and everything. He recorded everything.
So in the process is what it basically the whole.
And he would ask all these different people to play different things at the same time on top of each other. Or I wasn't there, so I don't know. But I arrived in the studio and I put up the faders and I go, but this is enough to make like 12 records. There's like, you know, some trombone solo and some guy on organ and electric piano and another guitar part and 3 or 4 different vocalists that all sing different lines that have nothing to do with each other. It's like, what is this? Like, what am I supposed to do kind of thing, you know? So, and also because there was no budget, so I didn't have enough money to hire the engineer that I would usually work with, and I figured, well, this is like, you know, one of those little records, whatever, I'll just do the best I can on my own, and we'll see what happens kind of thing, you know? But that was okay, I didn't have a problem with that, because it would enable me to really go through the tracks, and what I used to do at the time is I would take like pieces of paper and try to make like a piano roll kind of chart where I would write every track, you know, from left to right with the timeline, and then I would make notes as to how many bars, what section was what. For records that had sections, this did not have sections, but I was still able to sort of map out roughly where this vocal was happening, where that solo was happening. So I could see on the chart where, like, say, there may be good moments where the percussion was great, it was also a good vocal and all that. And back in those days, you know, it was very difficult to move stuff around. That would involve having a second multi-track and doing offsets and all sorts of synchronizing when the tempo was kind of fluctuating. It would have been, you know, very time-consuming. It's very possible, and sometimes we did it, but not on sessions like this, where every minute that was passing by, the guy's like, oh my God, it's going to be too expensive, the budget, you know, so it had to be done really as fast, expediently as possible. So you know, there was all these parts, they were pretty good. And I started doing a mix, and a lot of it has to do with edits. Like I'd find a piece here that I liked, and another piece over there later in the song that I liked. The tempo was a little different, but whatever. You know, figured out a way to kind of make it not too bad, you know, smooth it out a little bit maybe. And I just made a mix. Okay, the mix is done. I listen to it. Yeah, it's not bad. And I just go home and I listen back to the mix I did. And I was like, this is so awful. This is just so very bad. So I called the video game I hate the mix I just did. I have to go back in the studio. You have to pay another $5,000. I'm sure you can imagine how thrilled he was. It's like, but I don't have money. I don't have, I can't pay for it. I was like, dude, nothing I can do about this, all right? You asked me to do it. I'm doing the best I can. I'm really trying to help you out here, but if I give you the thing I did now, it's not going to do well, and it's just not, I won't have it. And he goes, well, can I hear it at least? And I go, no. Take my word for it, it's not good. I just have to go back in. And he goes, yeah, well, that's not going to work. I don't have enough money to pay for another session and all that. At that point, I go just like, I was bringing the studio a lot of work. So I kind of told them, look, guys, I really need to go back and do this thing. Just give me a second to work it out. And they were like, okay, fair deal, fair enough. I mean, after all, I was bringing them like probably 75 or 100,000 worth of business every year, so they could afford to give me a little break on it. It's one of those night sessions where nobody's in the studio, so they just give you the room because there's, downtime. They just had to pay for an assistant engineer to patch things for me, and that was it. So we went back in the second time. Now, because I had done that first mix, I kind of already had a better idea of...
Somebody get that for me. Just push the button there. It's alive. Just put the button on the side. Thank you.
You could do what I did, put on 5
That's what's about to happen right now.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, I figured, well, by the time I went back in, I was quite a bit more familiar with how things went, and based on what I had done the first time, seemed like I got right away into a better mood. I remember focusing on the horns because it had some really great horn parts that were kind of lost in there. And the way they were in the record, it didn't make much sense at all to me. But I figured, let me use that as an intro, because if the horns are kind of by themselves, then I don't have to, figure out that the horn line is fighting the piano and it's not going with the bass, and it's all clashing, it's all wrong to my ears. But I figured by making it simpler, I was going to get a better result from it. So I kind of did that, and that, is obviously the intro that you can hear when as you can see, it just kind of was a situation where really it was far more about, instead of trying to make all these completely weird elements work with each other, what really inspired me the second time was to take a little bit more bold and kind of avant-garde kind of approach and use simpler elements and highlight them and not try to make things like I was used to making on other mixes where it was always about getting good groove going between the bass, the synthesizers, all these vocals and all that. This here was more about trying to find individual things that really, really worked they could each come on, and even though they didn't have anything much to do with the stuff that came before, it still kind of had enough of a decent sound of its own that it kind of made sense somehow. And so I started taking pieces from different parts of the master because I didn't really like the way the structure was going as it was recorded. But once I got down to that level of just like one melodic element plus the drums, I started going fishing around, like you heard, after the horn line, and just go for the drums and some percussion, the organ, and then the bass comes in. And right away, it made so much more sense as long as it stayed very stripped down. As long as I did not bring, more than 2/3 of the instruments that we're playing were all muted and all completely.
So you have to strip it back.
I completely had to strip it back. And consequently, because I did that, suddenly when that vocal comes on and goes, then you really hear it. It's not like in the album mix where it was kind of lost with that girl, asking so many questions. It's like, no, please, no, don't do that. Just, find the good bits and just make them come across and right up front. And I think from the first mix I did, this is what really changed. I think when I did the first version, I was still trying to create parts and progressions that were more traditional because they're incorporating a lot of different instruments that we're playing, but I was still trying to make sense of it as coherent arrangements where multiple things were playing at the same time. And I think even though I'm explaining it to this like that right now, in hindsight, whatever, later, you can always rationalize everything, right? And none of that was really something I was thinking about when I was doing the mix, but I think instinctively, that was the only solution I was going to find to making all these weird, disparate, clashing elements really do anything that's going to be making sense. So it really, the way I did it, I would not do like whole passes of playing the tape from beginning to end. It was much more about playing little sections, finding a good piece, and then going, okay, because I already had the intro, already had the piece with the bass and the beginning with the organ, then I'd stop the 2-track, the recording. And then I go to somewhere else. I kind of kept that in my head when I had just finished recording. Then I'm fishing for the next piece to edit into that one I just did. And then I would try different things, until it worked. And I go like I asked the assistant, I'll play the tape, the 2-track when I recorded, a little piece, and then stop. Then I play the multi, and I go, oh yeah, that could be okay. So there's a lot of edits where like 16 bar or 32 bar segments are really taken from various parts of the tape, and I kept adding a little bit more at a time. So from the section of the organ, then we get back into another section with a male vocal and adding a couple instruments, but still, whenever I added one instrument, I tended to take other instruments out, so the focus was still never crowded, because I thought there was a danger about the record that as soon as you added all these things together, maybe in Arthur's mind it was wonderful. And I understand, in all fairness, right, from a compositional standpoint, there are a lot of people, like John Cage, for example, being one of them. And you know how big John Cage is in the clubs, right? Sure. But basically, there used to be a time where, as a composer, John Cage would throw the I ching assign different musical notes on different instruments to different parts of the guy chain, and he would just pick by chance, and he would let chance decide how the composition would go. And I think Arthur was very, very much into that. Maybe not the same way John Cage was, but in his own manner, he was very conscious of things like this. And when he got musicians in the studio, he felt that his role as the producer was not to tell them necessarily what to do. I think Arthur's view was that he was just a facilitator. He would just allow them to express themselves, and that instead of rigidly dictating to people, well, you're going to play this, you're going to play that, he was far more comfortable with the idea of allowing free rein to all these talented musicians and see what happened. And later, after the recording was done, that would be the time to actually reflect on that and see what could be taken out of that. And he was, instead of telling people, well, you gotta do this or you gotta do that, or please, like, say most arrangers would write charts, like, Tom 84, Charles Stepney, or whoever. It's all very structured and very clearly outlined. He was just looking for, I guess, what a lot of us call happy accidents, or weird moments where no one was planning for it to go like that. And I think Arthur was far more into allowing these sort of natural motions of people sort of improvising to create things that no one had planned on, and that I think he was valuing that a lot more than, the linear process of traditional songwriting, so to speak. So, from my perspective, while, again, today I could talk about all this, like, I was a professor at the university, and that's all great, but when I was in the studio doing this, I was really not thinking about any of that, and John Cage and all the other stuff. I was like, what the fuck is this? And how am I going to make sense of it? But yet, there's sometimes in the creative process where you feel like you're doing a job, and it's going according to plan, and you're basically going through the motions, and maybe the result is good, but maybe you feel like you were just going to work. But there are other times where it's not going so smooth, and you're actually really fighting and struggling to make anything happen. Everything is a battle, and this was one of those records where I was just getting angry at these vocals that I really hated. This girl, I thank you for asking me these questions. Please. Like, every time I opened her fader by mistake, I was like, no, not you,
right?
Go away.
Right.
And it was not the smoothest relation between what the thing was on the tape and how it made me feel. I was like struggling because I felt like I was always like sort of reaching, like I wasn't sure what I was going to do in the next 20 seconds of music after I had made these pieces, and I kept editing these sections together, and it started to sound good, but there was no link, and I had to really fight to make ways to create an atmosphere that was going to kind of make sense, and the thread, the continuity. And then after that male vocal came out, and he started, like, I put him right up front in the mix, really loud, because I felt he was incredible. That was like so spectacular. And I was like,
it's a very theatrical record,
and
very avant-garde.
Right, and I felt, well, you might as well feature things like this, because in fact, that's probably the best thing about the record. But again, featuring it by not having too many other instruments at the same time, because they're not necessary. And the more of them you're going to have in there, the more it's going to take away from how spectacular that thing sounded by itself. With, maybe just the basic drums and percussion, that kind of thing, but not much more. So that, kept going for like the first 3.5 minutes of the record, and then little by little I started finding slightly longer sections that kind of made sense with the organ and the electric piano melody, which I believe that Arthur played the electric piano. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe he played. Even though the cello was his primary instrument, I think he was also, but I could be mistaken on who played the electric piano on this actually. Anyway, that was like, to me, sort of the glue, besides the drums and the bass, kind of the glue that helped the record flow together. And then I just before I pointed out at the end of the original version, it was meandering. The melodies would not resolve, and they just kept noodling around and not going anywhere. And it was really, really frustrating. So I kept going to different parts of multi-track, fishing for things that I thought were good. And then I noticed that there was another female vocal that I hadn't really paid attention to. And that was Lola.
Well, who's Lola?
Lola Blank. She's actually crediting herself as Lola Love, but she's really the wife of the engineer who recorded Bob Blank. So, and she was going like bang, 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 go bang. And I was like, well, it has nothing whatsoever to do with the guy, but it's legit. I could see people getting into that. So I was like, fair enough, just let her have her moment, And
but she has a history as well. It's like on her own outside of Bob.
Yeah, she did a whole bunch of records that,
Did she work with Jack Brown?
Exactly.
And she did that. So maybe she was also part of Spooks in Space. Or some other things. I mean, because her husband was, Bob Blank, and there were lots of things that. Anyway, so her part, I was like, wow, this is okay. Let's give it a try. It's still sort of off, but not so bad. It actually has good energy, and even though it's completely different from the stuff that came before, you know what? Let's just let her do her thing, because it's going to save my neck. It's actually going to create like a break where it really raises the energy level up. So I just did that, and again, this was just that piece, not really until I connected it to the pieces that I had done before. I had no way of knowing what it was going to sound like, but I did it, and it was like, yeah, that's very legit. So suddenly, I have this record that starts sort of weird and completely abstract, and then builds into this jam with this guy going off on these piano kind of things. And
so just to be clear, not to interrupt you, but for those that don't know, when you're saying stretching and editing, you were actually cutting tape?
Yeah. So, you just do it a section at a time, and then you add it to your master, and then, so the master, little by little became like 2 minutes, 2.5, 3 minutes, and then the section with her came on, and I was like, okay, then suddenly, I think that section, I was able to get like 1.5 minutes, something like much longer than the other sections where it actually kind of made sense. And I was like, okay, that's good. And because the record had built like that, where it was growing, and then it was already going to this percussion section with a very strong female vocal, it kind of was leaving it open to going wherever I wanted to go after that. It didn't feel like I had any obligation to respect any sort of structure. So after that, I just went free form. And for whatever reason, I managed to find some other sections that I kind of like because they were naturally resolving into a real sort of low moment in the record where things went very quiet. And I actually remember sort of accentuating that so that after this big peak and all these mad kind of sounds, I could just bring it way down so that gather, it's like the storm is gathering strength again. And then, you know, there were all these tom-toms and things that were like sort of in there but really not heard. And again, all I did is I cut everything else out and brought them straight up, way up in the mix, and then did like some effects and things, and then suddenly it was like, wow, this is pretty good, you know. And from there, it just went naturally back to this guy, you know, and I was like, wow, this is terrific, you know, even though it's completely unorthodox because of the section where instead of keep the energy going and come way down, but it built back up and back up and back up, and you know, at the end, that enormous, you know, male vocal coming on, it was just like, you know, that's it, the record is done. Basically, I actually let it finish exactly as it was on tape, like the last 20 seconds, that's exactly the sound tape running out. I want to that's like exactly as it was recorded.
That's a fucking journey.
So, I think when I took it out of the studio, it was almost 10 minutes. There were a lot of sections that were longer. You know, typically when you do edits like that, you know, you make your sections and you try to make it. But it's very hard to have an idea of how the whole thing is flowing. And usually that's done afterwards. There were times where I would go in the studio when the songs were pretty structured, and I did all my pieces, and I didn't even bother editing them together because I knew they were going to fit, because everything is very steady and predictable, and I know, well, the keyboard was here, but when it comes back, it's also going to be like that, but there's no reason for me to spend time trying to fit them together, because I know that it's going to work. But in this instance, everything only happened once and never happened again. So if I didn't do it right there in the studio, I could really make a big mistake and have sections that would actually not fit at all. So I did, you know, most of the structure and everything in the studio rather than later in the edit room. But it was much longer. And
About how long did it take?
the whole session, the second session, was pretty short, like 11 hours, 10, 11 hours. We started at 7 o'clock at night, and by 6, 7 in the morning we were done. And then I took the master back with me and just, you know, living with it for a day or two, and then it was obvious what I needed to cut out. And I just turned in the mix at like 7.5 minutes. That felt like that was spot on. I mean,
wow, the rest is history. So what did Will think about when they first got hold of that?
yeah, he you know, he cut some refs and they went around and played it, and so did I. And the reaction was immediate. It was just so quirky and so completely off anything that anyone had ever heard at that time. You know, it really kind of carved a space for itself. And especially because of the support we get from David Mancuso at the Loft.
Because a lot of people think actually that you designed that song for the Loft in particular, that
sensibility. Arthur was heavily influenced by what he saw happening at the Loft. So there's no question that even though in the studio he would let kind of the musicians do their own thing, before they started playing, I think he sometimes would give them a direction as to what kind of thing he wanted them to play. And this was pretty much, you know, the idea that even though if he didn't want to acknowledge it, he he was still trying to get a good dance record going. So this kind of was what he felt probably was one of the tracks, because he was recording a whole album as Dinosaur L. The album was called 2424, and he, I think even in his own quirky and completely original and idiosyncratic kind of manner, he felt that there was very much connection to what he saw happening at the loft when people were losing it, expressing themselves through the dance.
So the chaos on the dance floor.
Yes. But, I can't speak for Arthur on all this.
What kind of person? I mean, you knew Arthur. You said you had him. When we were speaking earlier, you had him playing on some of your sessions before that. What kind of person was Arthur?
No, after that, actually.
Actually, after that, okay.
Yeah.
So,
Well, he was pretty introverted kind of person. Like, say, when he came to the loft, he was not like the guy talking it up with everybody and hey, this is my record. He was always the guy that was quiet on the side and just observing and more like being the fly on the wall. And he had quite a lot of friends and stuff and spent time socializing with people. But in general, I don't think Arthur was a very outgoing, effusive kind of person. He was more like very introspective and he kept to himself, sort of. I mean, once I got him started talking, there was no problem.
gotcha.
But he was a bit shy, and also, he reminded me that, besides doing all this, you should be aware that Arthur was in a band that was signed to Sire Records called The Necessaries, I think. So,
Never heard of that.
the band project was supposed to be a big deal, and it could well be that it's sort of like, indie kind of bands, playing like rock, and obviously for people like that, they quickly got a lot of major label interest, and that could potentially have developed into something much bigger than whatever he was doing for the dance music market, which was more like, I don't want to say an afterthought, but that wasn't necessarily his only focus. So he had other things for him. And actually, sometimes we spent time talking, and he reminded me that he didn't really come, from a big city. He was really a country boy, and that where he was from, the Midwest, it was all flat. And all he would see all day long is farms and tractors and corn. So that's all in the Corn Belt. It's not a surprise. That's really sort of autobiographical. Because to him, he was telling me actually he wanted to write songs or what I mean by that is not so much maybe experimental compositions, but things that were more almost like proper lyrics and all that, but his inspiration might be very, I don't want to say pastoral, but like country influenced. And it got to the point where he would tell me that actually I shouldn't just ignore country music because they had some really great artists. And honestly, me personally, I was having difficulty, being my own, like Herbie Hancock, James Brown, Miles Davis, Hendrix, the kind of world. It was like, country is great, but you know what? Please, Arthur, not today.
It doesn't penetrate me.
I have a headache. Not tonight, honey. I have a headache. No, but he was obviously using a lot of, the music, the songs that he created as a vehicle to express what his inspirations were, and I think a lot of that came originally from being a country boy. And he was implying to me that rather than being ashamed of it, he'd be much more into celebrating the fact that there are some very beautiful things in the countryside or in the Midwest, even though to other people it might look like a boring, field of wheat or corn or whatever. I guess he found a certain poetry to it. There's this famous picture of him playing cello or viola right by a water stream by himself, sitting on a chair playing the cello right alongside the river,
Yeah, a lot of people didn't even know, from listening to that record, that he actually was played the cello. You wouldn't get that, and the record is so avant-garde, it's like, because I don't think there's a record outside of that was before that sounded like that, really, honestly, because it was the way that everything was culminated. Of course, they had the jazz funk. There was some kind of similar jazz funk stuff, some Miles Davis stuff that was maybe as chaotic in a certain sense, but this record was like it kind of galvanized all of that into one thing. Nothing like it. Let me ask you a question about Dave Mancuso's approach. That he had played immediately? Did it take him time? Or he was just like...
Oh, no, he just right away. Because, Steve D'Acquisto was a regular...
Who's Steve D'Acquisto?
Steve D'Acquisto is one of the earliest DJs.
Right.
Who I never even saw him DJ because by the time I came, he had already retired.
Wow.
So he was, part of the Loft staff, and David's confidant, like his right arm man. So if Steve said that something was good, David was going to listen to it. And being that Steve D'Acquisto and Arthur Russell had collaborated on the Loose Joints project and so on, it was obvious that Arthur was already kind of part of the Loft family. So as such, David was keenly aware of what was going on. And obviously, when something new was going to come from Arthur's camp, plus the fact that at that time, David was really, really into all the mixing that I was doing.
Okay.
So if I brought him a mix that I did of something that Arthur produced, that was like, okay, whatever record is on right now, just take it off. We'll put your record on immediately. Like, don't even think about it. And that's what happened.
Wow.
And
did the record gain its popularity from the Loft, or would you say the garage? Would you say probably
everywhere I got it played, or Will Sokoloff got it played, like the early acetates. I think Will had one, Arthur had one, and probably me, and wherever, it caught like wildfire. Like, we got it all, covered the same weekends, or the same 2 or 3 weekends. And everybody was asking for it. What is this record? What the hell? The fuck? Every person that was in the club, when they heard it, they were just like, this is just so completely like...
Let me point out, what year was this?
I think this was 1980 or 81.
I remember the song.
It just was completely unlike anything else. There was, a lot of records you could say, well, this one is like that one, so it goes well together. It's like, if you heard Evelyn King, I'm in love, Kashif, that goes just very well in D-Train because it has that sort of nice synthetic bass sound, good R&B vocals, and, fair enough, but Go Bang was like, there was nothing whatsoever that would compare to it.
To this day.
Except, actually, in some weird way, some of the more like punk rock or new wave kind of records that were really not paying much lip service to melodic and arrangement kind of approaches. When you heard a lot of records that came from the UK, from that time period, like, late 80 or early 81. Yes, there were like some really nice songs, like a Depeche Mode, I Just Can't Get Enough. That was obviously more or less a pop song with synthesizers and really well laid out. There were all these other angry records like The Clash or, Bananarama or Susie and the Banshees or, Simple Minds Simple Minds is already too fancy, but they were more like basic raw records like Bow Wow Wow, Adam and the Ants and things like that. They just sort of like harsh, hardcore percussion and, little vocals squeaking on top of and okay, great. But say for example, who did that remake of Shack Up? Not Front to 42, but there was, the old song Shack Up by Ben Barra from 76, but then a UK band redid it around that time, and it was the same thing. They tried to get funky, but it was limited, and oftentimes all you heard was a drum beat, a bass line, and a vocal, and in some way, Go Bang went really well with those kinds of new wave, like post-punk kind of records, like Public Image Limited did, and
So the sensibility of the time and
yes,
that was happening at the time, it just kind of lent itself to kind of.
And even though it's not acknowledged as widely, on the B side of the 12-inch I did, Arthur went for a more like a rap kind of thing, and Clean on Your Bean was really an early hip-hop record, but again, a very avant-garde kind of approach. So sadly I don't have that with me here, so I can't play it for you, Clean on Your Bean, but if you look it up on YouTube, I'm sure you'll find 100 versions of it, or at least 99. And what I did is, instead of having vocals up front in your face like most hip-hop records had it at the time, I decided to put all the vocals in like an echo chamber and a delay to make them like shimmer and kind of like more surrealistic kind of. And I remember when I did the mix, which this was done in a real hurry because there was just a B-side, there was no money. I think I must have done it in 2 or 3 hours. Like just put it up, okay, done, finished. Oops, sorry, I'm done, okay, stop the clock. And basically I was creating like, instead of making the vocals be up front and focused as most hip-hop records have them, I decided to treat them as a texture. So I would just bring that shimmery, echoey thing in and out. And it didn't really matter if you understood what they were saying. To me, it was more like an atmospheric thing that kind of went on. But the point there was just that Arthur was also interested into this sort of fusion between modern sort of rhythmic, dance music and the sort of early hip-hop things that were going on, like in 1980, 81. It was really early days, even though they had the traditional rappers like Curtis Blow and, Treacherous 3 and the Heartbeat. There was
Another version,
a version of Heartbeat that was done to a rap and all that, but most of it was very simple. And Arthur was not beyond experimenting with that, because obviously he did it on his own records. So I'm not exactly clear on what he expected out of all these things, but certainly you can listen for yourself. The album Dinosaur L 2424 has been re-released, so you can certainly hear some of these other tracks. I think all of them are very sort of like all over the place and completely, maybe, I don't want to say unorganized, but very free form it's a whole different conceptual approach to presenting music, but I feel
It's
that
almost like a non-genre form of music if you think about it. It's got all these different flavors in there, you know. And of course, you're kind of describing the idea that this was his kind of like love letter to the dance floor of the law. You know, it kind of gives you that because you have all these different ethnic treatments in there too. It's very interesting. But you weaved it in very well. And we didn't know it was such a chaotic, you know, program like that.
So we heard the album.
Yeah, right.
That changed.
Yeah, like we didn't. That wasn't. Yeah. So what was Arthur's original, you know, response to like, you know, you stripping it down? I mean, was he like, oh yeah, that's what I was looking for? Was he just like,
I don't think he got it at first because, and you know, in all fairness, whenever you do something, I think that you personally get used. You have certain expectations, and you tend to hear it a certain way, and when somebody presents it to you in such a completely different way than when you heard it, where instead of featuring the parts that he liked, I completely took them out.
right?
So I don't think he was too pleased at all for about 10 minutes. But then he saw how people were getting down to it, and he was like, holy shit, is this my record? And, you know, it didn't matter what he thought. At the end of the day, this thing was like a tidal wave. I mean, you know, a couple of months later, it was all over the place. Any place that you went to, they were putting it on. It was on the radio. Obviously, Will Sokolov had quit his job at the arcade, at the game arcade. He wasn't working there anymore. He actually had, you know, enough of a record on his hands that he could pay for an office and start working sleeping bag records.
How many copies of that do you think was sold at that time? Like, just off the top? I mean,
I really have no way of knowing, but I would say it had to be in the 50 to 100,000 at least.
Wow.
No, I mean, come on, records like
In just New York, probably.
when I'm basing myself on sales figures from when I knew D-Train and Child Red and things like that were selling. I mean, D-Train was 500,000.
Wow.
You know, and I'm saying at that time. I'm not saying later, because later it sold even more. But like, say, a lot of people don't realize there's certain records like Secret Weapon, Must Be the Music, 300,000, all in the South.
Really?
Oh, yes.
I can believe that.
Yeah.
My question though, the response of that record, and I remember in Chicago, I believe it was, because at that time I was in high school. And I remember the Playground, and I remember Sawyer's or Sours. I remember, and Mendel too, how big that record was.
these were clubs in Chicago. Well,
It was
Mitchell's like,
a big anthem here. So the first question I want to ask you is, how was it? How did it go over at the Paradise Garage with Larry?
Instant hit.
It was automatic now.
Instant. Like, maybe not the beginning, but by the middle of the record, once Lola came on, and people could not get enough of that bango, bango, bango. It was just like it would seem to trigger them, like, and the guy, like, whenever people would hear that, it was just like, oh man, the party's on, that's it, shit is off the hook, the party's going, and for me, back in those days, at that time, that's all I was doing. I was basically living between the studio and the club, like spending half my time either at the garage or at the loft or at Better Days with T. Scott. Don't forget T. Scott, you know?
No, we forget him.
Don't forget T. Scott.
The music.
And in the studio pretty much all the time. I mean, even though a lot of what I was working on actually became more like pop kind of records and all that. you know, it was like a well-oiled machine, and even when Larry and I would do things together, we were like fine-tuned, like honed on a particular approach, and we knew right away, oh yeah, like body music and things like that, you know.
The Walter Gibson version, I listened to that version and it's a little different. Your version was the first version, or which version was first?
No, Walter was much, much later.
Much later. How many, in duration of time, how much later?
I think 87?
Wow.
I have no idea, I don't know.
But when did he actually do it?
I think when Arthur Russell and Walter were working together on the Indian Ocean, Let's Go Swimming, Tree Bell, and all that.
Yeah.
It's 86.
Yeah, that's right.
So I don't know how that came about, whether it's the label that allowed Walter to go in, or if Arthur had actually kept a copy of the multi-track for himself. I have no clue. I don't know anything about it. I mean, you know, I just think that if someone was going to ask me to do another mix today, I'm not sure what I would do, because, see, the brain, the more you hear something, the more the patterns of like a particular song have a way of imprinting themselves on your conscious, your perception of these musical parts. Being that I did it already once, and I was kind of, well, this is the best I can do with this. It would be really, really hard for me to go back in and do something that I think would actually mandate doing it. Like, will it really be a better result than what I already did? I mean,
Wow.
I know, for example, when I remixed Situation for Yazoo,
Classic.
that, you know, was a fairly humongous monster hit all across.
Yes, it was.
And 10 years later, in 1990, Mute Records asked me to do another remix because they wanted to put it out again as Situation 1990. So I kind of say that I would do it. And I really found myself struggling. I just thought, you know, what I did the first time was just good. And I would get into a situation where I was second-guessing myself and not doing certain things because, oh, well, I did it the first time, so this time around, let me not do it since I did it. And that is not the way you should approach, you know, making a record. You really should approach it as something fresh and new, but that's, in theory, because of these patterns that are imprinted in your brain from having heard the record so many hundreds of times, it's not easy for you to completely get yourself rid of that and just start what they call tabula rasa, you know, blank slate, and start all over again, because you can't forget, you know, like the young ones are saying, what has been heard cannot be unheard.
Okay, I have a question, and it's twofold. It sounds sort of like a cook. You had a love-hate relationship with this track as you were making it. Was there ever kind of like a cook in the kitchen when you're cooking something, you have to step back from?
See, this is what you get when you rotate.
Basically, you're really doing too much of it. Was there ever a moment where you highlighted to the point you did not enjoy that process at all? You did not enjoy the track? And I guess the second part of that is it did have kind of a post-punk, more of a new wave feel to it, as opposed to a straightforward dance
was fine. But I mean, when you're asking me the first part of the question, was that while I was in the studio or afterwards?
I guess during the process and after, was there a moment where you had to kind of step back?
Well, I mean, look, here I was, I had already spent so much of this guy's money on the first session, which I hated. And now I told him that I was going to go back. And I think the truth of it was that if he hated what I did, he was going to tell me that he wasn't paying for the session. And that means that I was on the hook for the money myself. So I had better turn something good. And I'm not saying this is what was going through my mind, but when I was in mixing it, there was no time to analyze or to think or to it doesn't matter whether I liked it or I hated it or I was fighting certain things or none of that mattered at all. I was just getting the thing done. And I didn't have an engineer, which I work with an engineer, so he gets the sound, he gets me the balance and all that. I can listen and go, oh, do this, no, not like that, and be more critical because you have distance. You can step back, you can go in the lounge for a few minutes, clear your ears. When you're at the board and you have to do it all yourself, there's no such luxury. You're like completely immersed in it, and I didn't have time to think about any of this. I was just like, gotta do it. And I'm looking at the clock and oh shit, I'm only halfway through, I only got 4 hours left. No. It's not like that. It's more like you're under pressure and you really, if you start thinking about stuff like that while you're in the middle of doing it, you're gonna lose the plot. You can't, you don't have time. I think the point about doing stuff of that sort is, in general, you have to stay focused and you can't have distractions. You can't check your social network feed and see how many likes you have and, oh, hey, yeah, look at me, hey, oh. No. It just, right. And as such, I don't think that any of that ever entered my mind at all. And, I'm sorry if this sounds overly simplistic, but I think there's a real danger in analyzing or overthinking while you're in the creative mode, and I mean that very seriously. If anything, a lot of these things, and this was done in a very short amount of time, like say when I did the A side for the D Train, Keep On. I was in with Hubert Eves, the producer, and again, we were at the studio, at Jerry Ragaboy's studio, where the engineer was so inept, we just sent him home. We just said, look, go away, you're slowing us down, you don't understand what we want. And I just say, look, I'll do the best I can to Hubert, producer. And we came up with a brilliant A-side. We did it in about 10 hours. And then, typically, you sometimes the artist, once you have the version you want, they're going to want a TV track so that they can go perform it. Without the same exact mix, but without the lead vocal. So they sent me back in the studio a week later, maybe 10 days, and they basically said, okay, you got 2 hours to do, pull the whole thing back up, make it sound exactly the same, and do the TV track. So, some studios, they keep notes and everything, so you know exactly what you did. In this instance, I don't remember how many notes they kept, but, we brought up the thing, we did the TV track, and we had a little bit of time left, and I go to Hubert, let me just play with the faders for a second here. We printed our TV track, it's good, sounds okay. Let me just try something, and I had like 15 minutes, and I just did a little dub piece, and, I just said, oh, let's print it. And 15 minutes. And then basically that became that dub of D-Train Keep On that everybody loves so much, even though it was very short. But it was done in 15 minutes. Well, when you do things like that, you don't have time to think, is what I'm trying to say. And if you do, I think you know, it's like when you're in a race car and you're driving 215 miles an hour. There really isn't time to think, you know, about the relationship between the pink and the purple and that painting over there. You just you have your eyes on the road, and if you take your eyes off the road for a second, that's it. You're like roadkill, you know? So I think that's a really important point, because compared to the way most people are working today, where everything is done in layers, one thing at a time on a computer, these at the time were performed live. In other words, like say for Go Bang just as well as for D-Train, there was no automation used. There was no computer remembering what the fader moves were. This had to be done all at once. Sometimes in some sessions, there would be 2 or 3 people remembering, oh, okay, here, I put this one up, and you know. But in this instance, I didn't have an engineer on Go Bang, so I was so absorbed by all these moving faders and sending effects and cutting, and there's no way you can think about all this other stuff. It's like, you know, that's for the pundits and the critics to do later, to their heart's content, and I'm sure they enjoy it tremendously.
What type of, speaking of that, I was saying you probably didn't have total recall on the board. What type of gear were you using on Go Bang? What type of mixing board?
At the time, this was done at Right Track Studio A, and they had an MCI JH24 console, a big one, like 40 or 48 channel. It's an MCI inline console. It's pretty classic, you know. The MCI is transformerless and it has a pretty open sound, but it's not like the SSL that had the built-in noise gates and compressors or any of that. It's more basic console, but you know, it was obviously very well maintained. Everything was totally working 100%. No mess ups, no, you know, very competent assistant engineer. He kept everything patched and all going properly. So, you know, I think that was an important part of it. In other words, I really was working at the world-class level as far as gear and equipment and all that. There was no compromises. This was the same console that we used to mix body music by the Strikers or Let's Go Dancing by Spark. You know, all those records were mixed on that same console. Or I think we also did This Charming Man, The Smiths, and you know, a bunch of other records. All of which sounded terrific.
Yeah, the Sonics in Go Bang was excellent. I mean, the way it's recorded, I mean, it sounds very deliberate. I mean, very deliberate. I mean, it's...
But again, it's only because it's simplified. Like, the main difference, I think, more or less, I had a lot of the same parts picked in the first mix that I did, but I had extra instruments in there, and they were really in the way. They kind of either clashing or distracting or mucking up the focus, the flow and the thread of the story. Whereas in the second mix, I was able to completely strip it down and not feel bad about it. And I was like, no, it sounds so much better like that. And kind of just really went like that, you know.
This sounds strange. But my 2 favorite records are Go Bang and Hit and Run. And I feel like the common denominator for both is that you took out all I'm not gonna say garbage, but you took out a lot of elements that weren't necessary. And I feel like Hit and Run was the same deal, because the album version of Hit and Run and the 12-inch version of Hit and Run are two different records. And basically all he did was take the lead vocals out and pretty much just left her ad-libs in the background, which made it a much stronger record. So basically I'm saying, a lot of times people try to complicate things when they're making records by throwing everything in there instead of like kind of simplifying things and using the basic elements to bring out the sonics.
But yeah, I mean, there's no question that back then, as much as today, I personally felt fairly proud that I was able to do this, because it was not just by accident. It was deliberate. Like, I weighed and evaluated all the, a lot of times when you're doing pieces like that, a piece at a time, and trying to add, little segments to your master, a lot of it, it's like you're trying permutations. You're, okay, well, what about if I do the organ, and the vocal, and the drums with no bass? No, that doesn't work. Okay, let me try percussion, organ, and finally there's something that works. So I had to go through a lot of that. It's like a process of elimination. Like you do things and they just don't work, and you go like, no, okay, no, let's try this. Okay, yeah, well, that's maybe like that. And it's not by accident that it happened. In other words, I was carefully evaluating a lot of different combinations of instruments, and I guess the really important part about it was the thread of the story, and I tried to keep in mind very consciously what was going to happen on the dance floor, and the crucial part between the sort of failed attempts that I had in the first mix is that by the second mix, I was much bolder. I think in the first mix, I was still too respectful of all the stuff that was on there, even though I didn't like it very much. I kind of felt an obligation to leave some of it there, and it just wasn't working. And by the second time, I think I lost all pretense of being a nice guy. And I just went for what I thought needed to be done, even if it was going to hurt everybody's feelings. And really, as a general rule of thumb, I think that is what needs to, happen whenever you're an editor or you're working on, whether it's a piece of audio, it's a film, it's an interview, or this or that. I think it's all the same thing. It's not just a matter of making the pieces and making the parts and thinking up of good bits. It really is first putting it all together in a sort of semi-coherent manner, and then looking back and fine-tuning it and editing it down so that there are no redundant parts in there, and no lulls or real parts where everything falls apart, unless you intend it to be like that because there's a purpose to it. But I really, I'm only trying to articulate that to say none of this would have been possible if I had just been like a producer or an audio person with no relation to the dance floor. The real guiding light for me was just the idea that because I had so much experience being at the loft or at the garage or at Better Days or on all these dance floors, I kind of knew right away, well, if I do this, people are just going to go like, what's going on? This is like falling apart. But if I did that, it's like, oh yeah, this,
Right.
you know, and I think more than anything, there's a real value, or there was at that time, a real value of being someone who was knowledgeable enough about the dance floor that I could try to illustrate with the music by selecting, you know, the particular tracks I was using and how I was mixing it. I was able to create something that was compatible with it, but still it retained enough of a musical sort of coherence that it wasn't just disjointed and made no sense whatsoever. And you know, it's yeah, there's a little bit of tension there, obviously, when you do that. But at the end of the day, I think, just like Mancuso says, the music plays you, and at some stage when you're doing things like that, I think the instrumentation or the arrangement or whatever's happening dictates to you what should happen and how good it can be if you just give it a chance to, even if it's contrary to what you believe should have been done in the first place. And I think this particular record, more than just about any other that I've done, was a classic example of that, is that somehow, despite what anyone else might have done, it sort of came alive on its own, actually. You know.
As far as your DJ, and I'm not sure which in that time that you were making that track, which was more a focus for you, production, or I'm not sure if you know you DJing at that time. Which one was more your focus? Going forward after that time, that record. When you created collectives like Body and Soul, you work with, you know, Danny and Joe, that process of production, does that also go into how you DJ and how your sets go? I noticed the diverse sound that you have in that unit. Are you able to utilize your ear and what you do with your production, and have it go hand in hand with who you work with, where they bring in their own elements? Just is a cohesive production in itself, how the three of you work together. Was that kind of a continuation of that going forward as a DJ?
I'm sorry, I
It's not thinking about it like
I can't answer that question like that. I think you're thinking about it in a completely different way than I approach it. I think no, but I mean, look, I'm not a DJ first. I come from being a musician. My first instrument was the drums, but I could play a couple more instruments. I sort of know about music a little bit, not too much. But I have enough knowledge about what it's like to play instruments, or that my approach to music is more generalized. In other words, I could just be dealing with funk or rock or classical music or, you know, jazz, a lot of jazz, certainly. The way I'm approaching it is really different, because some of these things like Go Bang, it did bring all these elements together, but when I'm approaching certain things, like say what we do as DJs at Body and Soul, it's more about diversity, and the reason we did something like this was because we just wanted freedom, and you know, is almost done as a reaction. Like say if you look back at the mid-90s and everybody was really into this pumping house and who was the baddest motherfucker and who could like kill the crowd the most on the weekends. And that's exactly like not what I was into when we decided to do a Sunday afternoon party. We were like, okay, you guys can kill the crowd all you want, just like destroy them, annihilate them, reduce them to mashed gravy and potatoes and whatever you want on the weekend, because, the clubs have to make money and there's this pressure of selling beer and alcohol and only playing the big songs and the banging, It was so loud I lost my hearing. Oh my God, I'm so happy. And Body and Soul was done exactly as a reaction against that, because the Loft, had inspired us to accept the fact that music exists outside the boundaries of just this narrow perception of what, club sounds should be like. And that if you allow yourself to listen to all these other things, you'll find that there's much beauty and dance and rhythm in all these other things. And I just felt that we never had a chance to play them in the normal context of clubs. So yeah, you could say that in some sense there's a little bit of similarity with Go Bang, because Go Bang was sort of an outside dark horse kind of record that originally didn't have much of a chance because it was not like anything else. It's the classic example of something that someone would never sign because the thing is total shit, but because it was allowed to come out, it actually proved itself as being far more influential and long-lasting than all the other things that conformed to the mold ever did. And the same way when, Body and Soul was started, we were definitely looking for something that was much more open, freedom, not telling people, well, you just get to play all these banging tracks. There's nothing wrong with playing banging tracks. We played some as well, but we didn't just do that. I think, like in the mid-90s, I remember I went to a club in London, and this was a great club with very, very famous people in the house scene. And Derek Carter was also a guest that night. But when the opening DJ came on, I just felt like I was in the kitchen. He was just turning tap water on. The music didn't have any sort of build-up or growing, or it was just turn the water on, okay? 6 hours later, it's that's fair enough. It's valid an approach. But I don't want to think of music as tap water.
Right.
So, if there's anything to do with, connection between, say, Go Bang and Body and Soul, I think would be in some sort of way a spirit that freedom and, being original means that you don't necessarily conform to guidelines, and instead of trying to feel constrained by whatever pressures or social, I don't know how to say it, but there's always a way to find some sort of freedom, and it's up to each person to really define how and where and why that takes place. And you can really do whatever you want as long as you allow yourself to do it.
Question for you. So that being the case, in the sense of speaking about Go Bang and the loft and the garage and an era that kind of bred the situation to happen, then later, of course, your Body and Soul's shelters and this kind of thing. Do you think that is something today that's lost that sense of freedom and thinking about, not thinking about genres, but thinking about great music? because that's more or less what that era was about. It's like, I like this song, this is how I feel about the song, I want to play it for you. I want you to experience it the way that I'm experiencing it. Do you think that that's something that's lost, or have you seen presence in that, philosophy?
Well, it depends on what part of the market you're looking at.
Because you got Deep Space, and that's
Yeah.
what Deep Space is about too. It's about,
Well, Deep Space is more about the spirit of dub, where I'm trying to acknowledge what happened more like in Jamaica, the original creators of dub, but also the connection that exists between what they did and other people who also were kind of taking that approach at the time, which was really to abstract song structure and instead conforming to, the sort of verse chorus that I was talking about before, kind of the presentation, to completely let go of that and illustrate, a whole different vibe, which is much more, abstract or completely spaced out. And I think that transcends just being reggae. It can apply to any form of music. And
well, it helps people to really think about, the idea that there aren't really boundaries. We limit ourselves.
we set those boundaries ourselves, but I think that on a social level, the groups of people that we spend time with and the things that we listen to, what we read, all those are influencers. All those are factors that kind of either push us to conform or encourage us to kind of get away from it. That's a very individual choice, I would say. Nowadays, because of the effect that social networks are having, it seems a lot of people are unconsciously seeking validation from their peers on a constant level. Maybe it used to be that you'd go to the club and, things were happening at the club. But outside of that, the rest of the week, you did whatever you did and you came back fresh and refreshed the next week at the club again. So you had a chance to kind of digest all that. But nowadays, I think it's constant. And but that being said, I don't see there being any less rebels.
But what are they rebels for?
And free spirits,
That's the question.
and people who decide to do their own thing and not pay attention to what the rest of the blogosphere or social media is saying, because they're exactly conscious that that is a very dangerous thing to pay too much heed to. An example of that would be the club in Sapporo, Precious Hall. They just do their own thing. They don't care what you think. They could give a rat's ass about what people talk about as far as what's now fashionable or considered cool or trendy. Or they just try to develop a community and try to welcome people and afford artists who they think are deserving an opportunity and a chance to perform and expose what they believe in. So every time someone says, well, are things today more so, less this, or, I think we can always find examples of situations, even if they're smaller, where people have taken it upon themselves to actually stay true to their ideals or not let themselves get swayed by all these external forces. I think there's a very important, a very salient point being made, which is that whenever certain things are happening, like the Loft or the Garage was in New York, it may be too easy to say that it just happened by chance. I don't think it happened by chance. I think that people like Mancuso were very conscious of what it is that they were doing by, say, in Mancuso's case, inviting people to his house and throwing a party at his house, but doing it on his own terms. And even though he was very much doing things that he felt people would enjoy, he never compromised or listened to what anyone else was saying as far as the critics or, it's a different approach. In other words, it's really up to each person when they do events or create things like this to decide whether they want to go for the mass market. Say, like, worst example of this would be when you're doing a company and instead of the company being private, you want to go public, and then once you go public, it's not your decision anymore. What the company does is up to the stockholders and the board of directors who decide what the company is going to invest in and what it's going to spend its time doing and who it's going to cater to and who it isn't going to cater to. In the same way when you do parties and you organize things like that, it's just important to remember that people like David Mancuso were consciously going for a certain direction, even though it was completely contrary to what everyone else was doing at the time and commonly accepted wisdom. I mean, the business model has always been to sell liquor and, have people charge at the door. And, Mancuso's model was, no, it's my house. I'll invite people. It's a private party, members only. You just contribute towards the cost of putting the party together, but then once you come in, there's no money anymore. No money changes hand. We're not selling you anything. There's no alcoholic drinks. We don't have a liquor license. You think it's archaic? I'm sorry, but every Labor Day, Burning Man welcomes over 50,000 people in the Nevada desert, and they're basically using the same ethos, more or less, which is you buy a ticket, you go in, once you pass through the gates, you're not allowed to spend money, you're not allowed to promote, to sell, to buy. Everything's free. That's what Burning Man's about. And you could very well say, well, this is for idealists and, old hippies and whatever else. But, in life, if you don't follow the direction which your heart is telling you is right, nobody else ain't going to do it for you. So it's up to each person to decide what they want to be, what they want their contributions to be remembered for. And I think the examples I quoted should just be an illustration that this sense of freedom is not something that is unique or specific to one particular time period, and as such is just, in my opinion, as possible today as it may have been back at that time.
Question. Did you ever come to Chicago and visit, let's say, Frankie in the 80s?
I met Frankie the week he left for Chicago.
Wow. Okay.
Exactly that week. Wow. That's when Larry introduced me to Frankie. I said, "Oh, hi, you're Frankie Knuckles. Bye."
Even as you were A&R at Prelude?
Yes.
Even as A&R, did you ever come to Chicago at all to even...
I'm sorry, I really wasn't traveling all that much on my own. The only time I was going to take trips is if Prelude was telling me, well, these people, these producers that do LAX, they're doing a mix, in Los Angeles. You need to go and make sure what's going on. So, or these people in Nashville, or are doing like a Lloyd Johnson or Saturday Night Band record, please go down and check what they're doing, and, you know. Or sometimes, like Theo Vanessa, I had to go to France for the sessions. But I gotta say, you know, I was just following orders. I mean, as A&R, I was trying to sign the things I thought were good, but most of the big signings that Prelude did were definitely not things I did. They were things that the owner, Marvin Schlachter, was doing. Like certainly D-Train, France Jolie, Sharon Red, all those big records. They're all things that they did. The only things I brought were things I heard at the club. I brought Martin Circus. I brought the Strikers, Body Music. I brought Powerline, Double Journey. I brought Rod Shake It Up, Duke Boogaloo, and all these were records that I only found because I was hearing them being played at the club.
Classics. Legendary.
My question is,
We got, not to cut you off, we got maybe like one more. Do we have any more questions? I'm going to shut this down. Okay, we're going to pass our time. One more question?
yeah.
One more question? Okay.
My question is, what was the next record that you did that was, I guess, close to the level of Go Bang, or the next big record that you actually did after Go Bang? What was the next track?
I'm sorry. It's kind of, that time period is such a blur because I was literally spending my every waking moment either in the studio or in clubs or traveling. In other words, I can't be sure of the timeline, but I think I did the Sharon Red Beat the Street after Go Bang. Slightly after, maybe. I'm not even sure, but you know.
That's another beautiful
Major.
record. That's serious. That is a lovely record.
Then, you know, I quit Prelude. I was in the middle of doing Martin Circus remix, and they didn't want to pay me to finish it since I became independent. And I was like, okay, well, then I'm not going to finish it, and just dropped it.
Wow.
Even though that rough mix ended up getting bootlegged.
Bootleg, yes it did. Yeah.
That was just a 10-minute rough mix, again, just listening and going, okay. But after that, I kind of decided to focus on other things, and I sort of quit Prelude. I was on a flight to England. I started working for Island Records quite a lot, and Chris Blackwell got me to remix U2, and I was working with Jawabu, Walker Zuke, and The Edge and all that, and I kind of switched gears at that point, and I decided instead of just focusing on club music, I was going to try to become more of a producer. And also, whether I liked it or not, a lot of the calls I got were more pop acts who wanted club mixes, but really they didn't have anything to do with, you know, dance music.
Now, is it true that you turned down the Madonna project?
I couldn't do it. She wanted me to work on doing some mixes for her, but I was busy doing experimental left field records with John Wobble, so
Yeah, thank you.
So the first Madonna record you turned down?
I never turned it down. They couldn't get me because I wasn't available, because I was overseas. So, but whatever, I mean, you know, it doesn't really matter.
But not to cut it short, of course, we ran over our time, and we need to do a part 2 and 3 and 4.
But, you know, I mean, to answer the question, I think even though that was a couple of years later, I still think that the work I did with Kraftwerk, like whether it was Tour de France or Musique Non-Stop on that whole album that I mixed, maybe it was in different ways, but it was just as significant. And I think today, looking back, some of that stuff is still very, very relevant. I mean, even though it's lesser known, I think I did a remix of Time Zone, the WAP style, that was like sort of a electro funk hip hop. I'm very proud of that. The Wild Style by Time Zone was quite good. But yeah, I mean, you know, just look at the Kraftwerk stuff. It's like, I think it speaks for itself, you know.
So can we end it on playing Go Bang? Let's
If
play
you
Go Bang.
like.
The Jack Waddle stuff is amazing.
Other than that, let's thank Francois for coming out.
Thank you.